The Bahamas is a group of about 700 islands and keys in the western Atlantic Ocean. They lie southeast of Florida and northeast of Cuba, and it only takes between 2 and 6 hours to sail from Florida to the main islands of the Bahamas, depending on your boat and travel plans. The Bahama deeps can range from 3,300 feet in depth to 6,600 feet. In what is sometimes called the tongue of the ocean, it's called that due to its U-shape and the way it drops off into a branch of the Great Bahama Submarine Canyon. It's not a place you would want to find yourself shipwrecked. According to the U.S. Coast Guard, there's almost zero chance of being rescued if you were stranded at sea without signaling devices. Typically, you can survive up to 6 or 7 days without water, but only hours without sufficient warmth. However, sometimes, miraculously, someone does survive against all odds. We call that a miracle. And that's exactly what happened to one young girl who dug deep to fight for survival.
I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is Hard Times and True Crimes.
Hey, so Darlene, you've got a new thing going on in your life right now. You want to tell us about it?
Yes, I just started a full-time job at Ashboro Housing, the new family self-sufficiency coordinator.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm loving it.
Good.
It's a great, rewarding job so far.
Yep.
If I can just learn all the techie stuff, you know.
You will. You'll get there. So that's exciting for you.
Yes. It's been really good so far. A great place to work. Like, everybody gets along. That never happens.
Oh, that's a plus.
It is.
That's
Nobody talks bad about anybody. It's so nice.
That's great. I was getting ready to say, well, if you don't hear anybody talking bad about anybody, that means they're talking about you.
True. Maybe
kidding.
they're all talking about me.
No,
I
totally
did though. It's so funny. Doing some training the other day, and it's this older lady, and she walks back into my supervisor's office. I never told my supervisor that I heard this, but anyway, I heard her say, "Do you think Darlene's gonna work out?"
Now, she's not going to listen, but do you think anybody else there is going to listen?
Probably, but they'll laugh. No,
okay.
They won't care. And she was like, "Oh yeah, she's good." Yeah. So I was like, "Okay, good."
That's so funny. I'm going to go ahead and jump in.
Yeah.
Summer's here. People are doing their summer things.
Yep. Are y'all swimming a lot?
Not as much as we would like to, but we're trying. We're trying to get over there to the pool quite a bit.
That's good.
And the boys are old enough that even if I'm busy and can't go, I can take them and drop them off. So that's nice.
That is nice.
Yeah. And we have season passes to Wet and Wild. So
are they doing that a lot?
Well, they've only done it once.
Okay.
But that's because Amos has driver's ed.
Oh, yeah.
Every day. And so
Okay.
that's really kind of cut into our fun. But once he's done with that, we're going to go more.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, people are doing their fun summer stuff, going out on the boat and stuff. Mm-hmm. So this episode today we're going to talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
Most of the time, I find myself, when we're talking about our stories, we're always saying, "Oh, that's crazy. This is a crazy story." And the fact is, most of them are crazy.
Right.
I mean, it's crazy. But today's story, I think the better word for that is it's just an amazing story.
Okay.
And so I want to share it with you. Just after noon on November 13th, 1961, a crew member on the Gulf Lion oil tanker off the coast of the Bahamas heard someone shouting, "Help! I have a dead baby on board."
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, the crew scrambled into action, and they got this stranded man. They got him onto their ship. He had been floating in a dinghy, and when they saw him, he was like waving frantically for help. And then the baby he was referring to was actually a little 7-year-old redheaded girl wearing a life jacket, but she was actually clearly deceased.
Oh.
Very, tragic. The man was 45-year-old Julian Harvey, the captain of a sailing ketch named the BlueBelle. He gave a thorough description of how he had been caught the night before in a sudden, strong squall, causing the ship to keel over, and the 48-foot main mast had snapped. Mm. It had come plunging down and pierced the wooden hull like an arrow.
Oh, wow.
So at that point, all hands were on deck. Everybody was struggling to get free of the debris. And Harvey started the gasoline auxiliary engine to try to give the boat some forward motion. And then he went below deck to get some wire cutters. When he came back up, the boat was ablaze, probably from that gas engine that he had started. He quickly went back down for some fire extinguishers, and by that time he discovered the hold already had 2 feet deep of water, 2 feet of water in it.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, he knew this was not going to end well. So he described to his rescuers how he had thrown the dinghy over the side along with a rubber life raft. He could hear the shouts of his passengers, and he could hear them jumping into the water. He had been forced to abandon ship, and despite his best efforts, it had sunk into the darkness. Mm. And unfortunately, he had been unable to save any of the other passengers, including his own wife.
Oh.
He had found the body of little Renee floating in the aftermath, and he had hoped he would be able to revive her, but by the time he found her, it was just too late. He did get her, but he knew that she hadn't made it, but he wanted her body to be able to be recovered, so he held on to her.
Yeah.
And they had been drifting in that dinghy for 14 hours before he was rescued. The rescue crew took him to Nassau in the Bahamas for a complete report. It had been a horrible, traumatic experience.
Sure.
Yeah, but when all the questions had been answered to the authorities' satisfaction, he returned to Miami on November 15th, and he had to go undergo some further questioning by the U.S. Coast Guard as well. And they sent search planes out looking for more survivors, and they were out there for several days. Just 2 days later, on November 17th, Harvey and his interrogators were in the middle of some of that questioning when a captain rushed into the room and exclaimed, "There's a survivor." They had found someone else.
Oh, goodness.
That person was 11-year-old Tere Jo Duperrault. Tere had been spotted the day before by Second Officer Nicholas, I don't know how to say this name, it's Greek, Nicholas Spakadakis of the Captain Theo, which was a Greek freighter ship. And when she was found, the U.S. Coast Guard dispatched a rescue helicopter, and they airlifted her to Mercy Hospital in Miami for treatment. She was actually barely alive, and she was able to just barely identify herself before she slipped into unconsciousness. Mm. Have you heard this one before?
It's vaguely familiar.
Okay. Tere Jo was the daughter of Arthur and Jean Duperrault. They had 2 other children besides 11-year-old Tere Jo. There was their son Brian, aged 14, and then their youngest daughter Renee, aged 7, who had been found already deceased with the captain. Arthur Duperrault was a 41-year-old native of Green Bay, Wisconsin. He had a successful optometry practice and was known around his hometown as Doc. He was married to Jean, a trim, attractive brunette of 38. She was a former secretary for the FBI, and the two had met in Washington. And now they were raising their 3 children in a white stucco house near the 10th hole at Shorewood Country Club in Wisconsin.
Oh, wow. Sounds picture perfect.
Doesn't it? Brian was their 14-year-old son, as I mentioned before. He was a freshman in high school. He was described as small for his age, but what he lacked in stature, he made up for in brain power. Mm-hmm. And he and his father, they were like a golfing duo that couldn't be beaten in that area. Mm. Tere Jo was the middle child, and then Renee was the youngest. The 2 girls were described as lively and bouncy. They were just your average all-American family. And the whole family, they were very skilled swimmers, and they loved being out on the water. Arthur had served 27 months in the Navy during World War II, and so he was very familiar with boats. Mm-hmm. Once during his stint in the Navy, he had sailed from the Florida Keys to the Bahamas.
Oh, wow.
And I'm sure it was a beautiful trip.
Oh, yeah.
So since he had done that, it had kind of been a bucket list, although we didn't use that term back then,
Right.
but it had kind of been on his, bucket list to do that again. His dream was actually to live on a boat and go around the world. By the time he was 40, he had actually saved enough money to be able to take his whole family on at least on a short version of that dream.
Wow.
So this trip was a planned 3-month excursion, sort of like a trial run to see if they could handle a bigger trip. Because, sailing around the world, not a small thing to be taken lightly. So the kids were actually taken out of school, again, before homeschooling was probably even legal. And they were put under tutoring from their mother during the duration of the trip, which for us, when we did our 3-month trip, I already homeschool. So that wasn't a big deal for me. So in November of 1961, Arthur had chartered a 60-foot sailing ketch named the BlueBelle for $700 a week, and that was just for a bare boat. That meant he was the one that was tasked with supplying his own provisions and hiring his own crew.
Okay.
He found experienced Captain Julian Harvey. Harvey was a retired lieutenant colonel and fighter pilot for the Air Force. The family, along with Julian and his wife Mary Jordan, boarded the vessel on November 8, 1961, and set sail from Baha'i Mar Marina in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, heading to the Bahamas.
Okay. I've taken that trip from Fort Lauderdale to the Bahamas.
I have too. Actually, that's when I got married.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We took the train to Fort Lauderdale, and from there we boarded the boat, and went over to the Bahamas and got married on the island.
Cool. That's right. You were telling me about that.
Yeah.
That's
and so you've done that same trip?
Yep.
Oh, that's cool. When did you do it?
I did it, me and my sister Delina and her husband and Curtis, we all did it. I want to say it was like 2012.
Wow. Cool. Yeah. Cool. So for 4 days, you can imagine the fun that the family had because you've done it. They enjoyed these adventurous days. They were sailing around the Bahama Islands, snorkeling, exploring the beaches, restful evenings, some fish fries, that kind of thing. They could stop when they wanted, and they did. New Providence Island near Nassau. They stopped at Great Abaco Island at Mastic Point. I mean, it was really a dream come true for this family. Julian's wife, Mary, she was a previous stewardess with TWA, and she took care of their meals, and he piloted the boat. So they kind of did this like a joint thing. They were hired on, and they were the crew. So the family, they're free to bask in all of their vacation, and Julian and his wife are doing the other things.
I love that.
Doesn't it just sound picture perfect, like you said? Man, that makes me want to do it right now.
I know.
And I don't even like being on boats. On November 12th, Arthur and his captain, Julian, they stopped at the Sandy Point Commissioner's office to file paperwork so that they could return to U.S. soil. And Arthur told them then that it had been the trip of a lifetime, and he told them, I'll probably be back before Christmas.
Oh.
That evening, the family sat down to their last meal at sea, chicken cacciatore. For some reason, they were going to sail at night, and they would make land the next day.
Okay.
And that would actually be the first time they sailed at night. They had only been sailing during the day on this trip. Tere Jo, the 11-year-old, she was tired, and so she went on to bed about 9 p.m. But the rest of the family actually stayed up on deck. They were just going to soak in those last minutes of vacation. You know how you do.
Yeah.
But the next thing Tere knew, she woke up to a nightmare. When Tere was rescued, she was near death. She was in the hospital undergoing treatment for dehydration, shock, and exposure for a few days. But finally, after those days of medical treatment, she was lucid enough to give her account of what had happened on the boat. She pretty much gave the same account that skipper Julian Harvey had given of the day's activities and supper. However, their tales take a sharp turn from one another at that point. Tere Jo explained that she had first been awakened by the screams of her older brother, Brian. She could hear him calling out, "Help, Daddy, help!"
Oh, God.
We'll be back after a quick break.
At the beginning of this year, one of my New Year's resolutions was to get my home decluttered and organized, especially my kitchen. Just going in there felt daunting. Even family meals were no longer enjoyable. I knew that I needed help because the thought of tackling it on my own was overwhelming. And then Melody told me about Shannon over at Functional Spaces. And let me tell you that meeting her transformed my kitchen from a cluttered mess to a cozy functional space that I once again can take pleasure in.
Everyone has that one chaotic area in their home that requires excessive time and energy to manage. Many of us can identify more than one. For Darlene, that was just inside her kitchen door.
Yes, everybody would come in and throw mail, keys, and coats all over the counters and chairs. I told Shannon this was such a source of stress for me. Why couldn't everybody just put their stuff away? And she explained that we could easily turn that area into a place of peace and productivity, a true functional space. We added a coat rack with key hooks and a small mail bin, and that has been a game changer. That's just one example of the difference she made.
Functional Spaces is based in the Triangle and serves Central North Carolina. If you're ready to experience that same transformation, go to functionalspacesnc.com and fill out the contact form. You will receive a link to schedule your discovery call to chat about your project area. Again, that's functionalspacesnc.com. Tell her your friends at Hard Times and True Crime sent you.
Gosh.
She could hear the noises overhead of people running to and fro, and then suddenly the noises just stopped. She wasn't really sure what was going on, and she kind of froze for a minute. She was just paralyzed with fear. But she finally came out of her room, and she ventured up on deck to see what was up. In the main cabin, which was used as a bedroom at night, and it was a kitchen during the day, she spotted her mother, Jean, and her brother, Brian, both lying in a pool of blood. It seemed they were dead, but she wasn't really sure at this point, but it just looked that way.
Right. Oh my God. Can you imagine how traumatic?
No. I mean, it's just so much for a kid to have to deal with. She actually had to step around them to climb the ladder to the main deck. And when she got up there, she saw the captain, Julian, and he had this wild expression on his face. And when he saw her, he came toward her and kind of like pushed her back down the ladder and screamed for her to get back to her room. And so she immediately did as she was told. I mean, he was kind of rough about it, but she thought he was directing her back down there to protect her. I mean, it was obvious something terrible was happening. And so she went in there and she waited for like her dad or Julian or somebody to come in and get her and tell her what was happening. But nobody did. And then she notices that water is beginning to fill up the cabin. And she's wondering, like, what do I do? And then at one point, Julian came to her door and he was holding a rifle. But instead of trying to help her, he stood there for just like a moment and he stared at her. And then without a word, abruptly turned around and just left. She didn't have any idea what to do. I mean, she knew now, like, this water's continuing to rise. It's already up to her mattress. Her mattress was starting to float.
Oh, bless her heart.
And so, she knows, like, this boat is sinking. And so she began to scramble out, and she's trying to get out of there. And she reaches the deck. She spots the life raft and the dinghy both in the water.
Yeah.
And she yells out to the captain, "Is the ship sinking?" And Julian, he actually answered her, "Yes." So he comes back and he holds out this rope for her. And that was the one that was like tethering the dinghy to the sailboat. And poor little thing, she was just like shivering so badly she couldn't hold on to it. His rescue craft was like drifting away from him. And when he realizes that, I mean, she's lost her grip, he just quickly jumps from the boat onto the dinghy without her and takes off.
Was he going to save her?
I think at that point when she started calling out to him, he was going to let her come along.
Okay.
But she couldn't get a hold of that rope, and he's like, he didn't want to miss his chance to get away. And so he just took off without her. So before she knew it, he was like gone into the darkness and had left her alone to fend for herself.
That's terrible.
I know, I'm like, I just think, what a coward. To leave a little child helpless to defend themselves in those elements when you have a life raft. Like, you could have worked harder there, buddy.
Yes.
She was left there to save herself. And this wasn't she couldn't start to even process what had happened to her family. She's truly in survival mode. She's got to figure out a way to get off the boat. And she did remember a cork float that she had seen strapped to the BlueBelle earlier. And so she went back for that. and somehow managed to release it just in time
Wow.
to get in before the vessel plunged underwater.
Wow. That's incredible.
It really is incredible. I mean, I think that was miraculous.
Yes.
I mean, I really do think God had his hand on this little girl.
Mm-hmm.
But for one horrifying moment, one of the lines of the boat, the BlueBelle, snagged on her and it pulled her under. And she doesn't even know how it happened, but the line worked itself free and she just kind of bobbed back up.
Oh, my gracious.
And so she was free of that sinking boat, or else she would have gone right down with it. So again, I think that was the Lord.
Oh, yeah.
But now she found herself alone in the water in the middle of the night, soaked, no provisions of any kind, and she's only on this little cork float.
Wow.
And she was actually afraid to call out to the captain again at that point because she knew then that he wasn't about to help her.
Right.
And so she just remained quiet. She spent 4 days out on that water alone.
My goodness.
Of course, again, in survival mode. But she had to be so scared.
Terrified.
Yes. That little cork float, it was only it was 5 feet long, and the bottom of it was like a net. So the water, she's still sitting in the water pretty much. It's just keeping her afloat. It wasn't even really long enough for her to lay down flat in. She kind of had to bend her knees and stuff. In addition to that, at night, it was really getting cold.
Oh, I'm sure.
And
Especially out on that water.
And she's in that water. And the days were super hot with temperatures of 85 degrees in full sun, kind of like it's been this week.
Yeah.
So you can imagine just how miserable. And she has nothing to drink.
Oh.
Her cork float was starting to disintegrate. She had no food, no water. Her lips were puffed up.
Yeah.
Her tongue was beginning to swell from lack of moisture. But because, her family had grown up around water and she had been taught well, she knew she could not drink that seawater.
I was going to say, I'm so glad because
Yeah.
I feel like I would.
Well, and
have.
when you're that thirsty and there's water there, even though you know it, sometimes you're going to think, but what if I just had a little
Yes.
drop? But she
Yes.
didn't.
Oh.
She didn't. She took care of herself. I mean, her situation was dire and she just continued to hold on. A couple of days into her ordeal, she saw a small red plane in the air. So she took off her shirt and she was trying to wave it down. And it was so close, she could read the details on the bottom of the plane.
Oh, my goodness.
And she was sure they had seen her. So she's like, I'm going to be rescued. But they flew away. They did not see her. And she was just so disheartened. And to me, again, I'm thinking she's a kid. I can only imagine that I would have probably given up.
Oh, yeah.
But she didn't. And she didn't know it, but at this time, she was in this water between the islands, but she was drifting continually closer and closer to the full Atlantic Ocean. And that would not be good.
No.
And she was getting weak. Now she's got a sunburn. We already know she's dehydrated. And she starts drifting in and out of hallucinations. She was slipping in and out of consciousness. And her float is continuing to break away. Pieces of it are breaking off. So there was she was not going to last much longer.
No.
And so it was truly a miracle when on day 4, the crew of the Captain Theo was in the Providence Channel in the Bahamas, and they spotted her amid thousands of whitecaps.
Wow.
And now get this, she was on a whiteboard. She had blonde hair. Amidst all those whitecaps, she was about as camouflaged as she could be. But one man, through binoculars, he just happened to notice one white speck that wasn't moving like the rest. He's like,
That's incredible.
Yeah, he was like, that one's not disappearing. Something's weird about that. He thought maybe it was a fisherman.
Right.
He thought, well, that boat's a little too small for that. But they thought, we got to go back. And so they could tell it was a person, and they made their way to her. One newspaper report said they could see sharks all around her in the water, and they feared they would not even reach her in time.
Oh, my goodness.
Now, I only read that in one newspaper account, and sometimes those aren't correct, and I tried to confirm it with more, but I didn't see it anywhere else. But it was in a newspaper.
I bet, though, in those waters.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And again, I think that was just the Lord's hand on that little girl because so much could have gone wrong, but she was, even though she was in some dire straits, she was being protected, I believe.
She was.
And of course, like I said, she was at the point of death when they reached her. Once she gave her account of the events to the authorities, she was told that the rest of her family were all unaccounted for except for Renee, which her body had been recovered with Julian Harvey, who was still alive. And it was evident that his version of a sudden storm breaking apart his ship and causing a fire was very different than the story she had given them. In fact, she said she didn't remember a fire at all. And as far as she remembered, the sea had been calm that night. She had not been woken by a storm. She had been woken by those screams of her brother.
Yes.
While Tere was in the hospital, Julian was being interrogated by the Coast Guard again. So when that man rushed in and said, well, there's a survivor.
I would have loved to seen the look on his face.
Wouldn't you? His response was, oh my gosh. And then sheepishly, he quickly added, isn't that wonderful? But then he almost immediately asked to be excused for the day because he said he was tired and he just needed some rest. He checked into the Sandman Motel, but for some reason he checked in under a fake name of John Monroe. Now, it could be that the media was wanting to talk to him.
Right.
I can see that. But authorities, however, would never get to hear his response to Terry Joe's story. When the maid arrived the next morning, she found him in a pool of blood. He had slashed his wrist, ankles, and then and then cut his own throat.
Oh my goodness.
And bled to death.
Well, he died a horrible death.
He did, and he left a note, and it said, I got too tired and nervous. I couldn't stand it any longer.
Is that all it said?
That was all it said. So whatever that means.
Okay.
I think he's nervous because he knows she just refuted his story, but yeah.
I'm really surprised they let him go.
Yeah. Especially when there was that many discrepancies.
Yes.
Looks like they would have at least held him over.
Right.
Yeah. The Miami Herald compared the two different stories of Terry Joe and Julian Harvey. This is what their quote. Little Terry Joe's comes through stronger because she fought with every fiber of her being to tell it. Julian Harvey died by his own hand rather than match his story against hers.
Yeah, that's good. Do we know what happened?
Well, kind of. They had to take her story and put it together the best they could based on their investigation of his past. Okay. So they still had to draw some big speculation conclusions, but I mean, they have a pretty good idea. Yeah. With her account and his suicide, authorities did indeed launch an investigation into his past and began to look more closely at his background. Mm-hmm. And so I'll tell you a little bit about Julian Harvey. Okay. Julian Harvey was described as a hell-for-leather adventurer. I had to look that up. Yeah. It just means reckless determination. Okay. Have you ever heard that term? No. Hell for leather? Mm-hmm. Okay. So he had been married 5 times before he met Mary Dean. Okay. Some said he was a typical woman's man, like a real fly boy. Yeah. Mary was an attractive brunette, 11 years his junior. She had been sunbathing on the rooftop of Miami's DuPont Plaza Hotel when he had spotted her. After 2 years, they had married in Tijuana, just 3.5 months before this boating excursion.
Oh, wow. So they were kind of newlyweds.
They were newlyweds. Okay. And it turns out that a string of bad luck had seemed to follow Julian Harvey. As a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, he had been involved in a plane crash that had injured him. He resigned his commission that year. In 1949, his second wife, Joan, and her mother were tragically killed when he drove their car off a bridge and into a bayou near Fort Walton, Florida.
He drove their car?
Luckily for him, he was able to swim to safety. But,
oh, my gosh.
But the 2 women were not so lucky.
Oh, no. Mm.
But lucky for him, again, not only did he get out, but he was the sole beneficiary of his wife's life insurance policy.
Okay. It's looking a little clearer now.
Isn't it? Just a few months after Joan's death, he married his third wife, George Ann. And that marriage only lasted like a very short stint. She claimed that they had married, divorced, and then remarried. They had sued the government for $300,000, and what they claimed was a botched hysterectomy. Their lawsuit was for loss of consortium, and I didn't know what that was either. Mm-mm. That's the legal term for normal husband and wife relations. Oh. So they sued the government for that based on a botched hysterectomy.
Okay.
And during the deposition for that case, it was found that Julian had sued the government before when he got a $14,000 judgment for the loss of a sailboat that had only cost him $1,500. That boat had rammed a sunken hull, and he claimed the government had not properly marked the hazard. So he has a history of suing for large amounts.
He's greedy.
Yeah. Then in 1955, a yacht, the Duperrault, had sunk under his piloting. And that was not the only boat that had gone down beneath him. Another one, a racing sloop named the Valiant, sank under him in 1958 after going up in flames. And now the BlueBelle was his third.
Wow.
So he has a history of accidents, lawsuits, and filing claims and sinking boats, apparently. Now, with this latest accident at sea, he stood to profit another $20,000 from his sixth wife, Mary Dean Jordan. And that would come in handy for him because the investigation revealed that he was having some financial troubles. When they went to through his papers and whatnot, they found several collection letters, past due bills, and the like. They're painting this picture of this financial motive.
Yeah.
These facts, along with the suicide and the implausibility of his story, led the authorities to conclude that Julian Harvey must have concocted a way to get rid of his wife so he could file a claim against her life insurance. They felt that he probably intended to murder her while they were at sea and make it look like an accident, and that the Duperraults were intended to kind of be eyewitnesses who could corroborate his story.
Right.
And that she had vanished. Like, he was going to make her disappear, and then they would be like, yeah, we were there, and, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But something had gone wrong. They didn't know if he had been caught in the act of killing her and then had to kill all of the eyewitnesses.
Right.
Or if he just panicked. They didn't know what the details were. Or if they had always been intended to be collateral damage. But the tragic end was that he purposefully did sink that boat, and 4 members of the Duperrault family had been murdered. They do believe that his intention had been to murder Tere Jo as well. And once he had started the boat sinking, he figured she was probably a goner. Mm-hmm. And so that's when he just left her there defenseless, which I think is just horrendous. Yeah. And he just didn't count on the fact that this little girl was such a courageous fighter. I mean, to me, it is amazing that she was able to survive that ordeal. And unfortunately, he took his own life before he could be tried for the crimes or any of those.
It sounds like he didn't go easy, though. Golly.
Well, I'm kind of glad because, I mean, that's horrible, the way those people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Tere Jo went to live with her grandmother, aunt, and 3 cousins in Wisconsin. A year after the tragedy, she changed the spelling of her name from Tere with a Y to Tere, Tere. I'm not sure why.
Okay.
And she just began trying to, pull her life back together and grow up with some sense of normalcy.
Right.
But of course, she would never forget the incident on November 12th that had really shaped her life. Despite her age, she never received counseling.
Oh.
However, she did find her own way to heal from the trauma. 50 years went by before she ever told the story in her own words. But she finally did in the book, Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean.
Oh, I want to read that now.
Yeah, and she's done some interviews that I watched on YouTube that listening to her talk, and it's inspiring.
Yes.
She described at one point how she didn't want to believe that her dad was dead because she had not seen him that night on the boat. She saw her mom and brother, but she never saw her dad. So somewhere in that little child's mind, she kind of had hoped that maybe he got away. And so as she got older, she described how she would take off on her own sometimes, and she would just drive down to North Carolina or Florida, the beaches, and just search for him.
Oh.
And she said that went on until she was around 35 years old.
Wow.
Before she finally accepted it. In the meantime, she grew up, married, had 3 children of her own, and she eventually retired on the banks of Lake Michigan. The co-author of her book, Richard Logan, he said it best. He said, "It was a story of more than surviving. It's a morality tale. It was a story of the power of evil, but it was also a story of the human spirit and its refusal to be dominated by evil."
Yes. Oh, that's so good.
Isn't it?
I mean, it's so bad, but it's so good.
That quote really captures the
Yeah.
essence of it, though, doesn't
It
it?
does. Gosh. Wow. So just pure greed.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's horrible.
Apparently, he had probably spent his whole life doing that sort of thing, conning people. I mean, if you think, I think of it as a con.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder too if they had caught him trying to murder her, his wife. Oh. Or if he was just gonna the whole time had planned, because it's weird that they were planning to sail that night.
I did think that was odd.
Yeah.
Like, were they on some kind of a tight time frame? And
Right.
I don't think they were. We don't know what his real plans were, but it does seem like there is something very sinister about it. I don't want to think that he's willing to kill a whole family with 3 children just to
Get a little life insurance.
right. Maybe they saw him and then
Yeah.
he just had to do something in a panic. But it's either way, it's just it's a horrible story to think about. Like that he's that kind of a person. And then when that little girl was sitting there in front of him and he leaves her, I'm like, I'm just dumbfounded. But he didn't count on the fact that 11-year-old did not go down so easily.
No. Oh, that makes me so happy.
Yeah. And I would like to have seen his face when they came in and said, there's a survivor. Mm-hmm. He knew immediately that his story was up.
Wow. Those sure were some hard times.
They sure were.
According to my buddy David, a lot of folks was disappointed they didn't hear my lovely voice last week. Well, you can't please everybody all the time, unless you tell them about hard times and true crimes. So regardless of why you're listening, you make sure you tell everybody you know, and the few people you don't, to check us out. Till next time, goodbye.